Hello, everyone, and welcome to ThinkTech Hawaii's program, which is entitled How Did We Get Here? And I'm the host of this program, which is a historical look back at Hawaiian history, primarily of the 20th century. I'm DeSoto Brown. I'm the Bishop Museum historian, and I'm also the curator for the Archives Department. And today you're going to be looking at pictures of items that are from my personal collection, not from Bishop Museum, where I work. And the theme of today's show is Hollywood Goes Hawaiian. And these are films made about or sometimes made in Hawaii by Hollywood. Now, Hollywood has been the primary producer of films in the United States, the location and the industry, for over 100 years. And Hollywood films have been spread all over the world, and their influence is still with us today. We're going to be looking back at films which are now obscure or unknown. Many of these you're not even going to have ever heard of, much less seen. But they were very influential in their time in how Hollywood chose to portray Hawaii as a setting, its environment, and also its culture and its people. How many of these were realistic? Well, many of them were not. Were there misrepresentations? Yes, there were. So it's important for us to be aware of where some of these misrepresentations have come from and how pervasive they once were and sometimes still are. So we're starting with a shot of three diverse movie posters. The first one on the upper left is called Hula. That's a film from 1927, not filmed here. In the center, a film called Hawaiian Nights, which was actually released under the title of Down to Their Last Yacht, which is an extremely strange screwball comedy. This is an Australian poster, so it has a different title. And finally, down in the lower right, Ma and Pa Kettle at Waikiki from the 1950s. So we've covered 1920s, 1930s, and 1950s in this slide. Ma and Pa Kettle were a continuing series of comedy characters who were appeared in a number of films, in a series of films from the late 40s into the middle 1950s. So speaking of comedy films like Ma and Pa Kettle, we talk first about a particular genre of film, which usually is comedic, and those are animated cartoons. Animated cartoons, for the most part, were made in this time period of the past as short films, just a few minutes long. They were originally made to show in movie theaters to audiences before they saw the feature film or films that they came there to see. But many of us became more familiar with them when they started to be shown on television in the 1950s and then onwards. On the left, these are two Disney films, by the way. On the left is a film from 1938 called Hawaiian Holiday. And as you can see, there's Mickey Mouse and Donald Duck surfing towards shore. And it's a comedic film in which various funny things happen on the beach in a fantasy Hawaiian setting. But on the right is a feature length comedic comedy cartoon film. And that's Lilo and Stitch, which was released in the 2000s. Also a Disney film. Disney had pioneered successfully the feature length cartoon film in 1937 with Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. And this film, Lilo and Stitch, is about an alien from outer space who you see there, Stitch, manages to find himself on Earth, or in the Hawaiian Islands at least. But what's important about Lilo and Stitch is that it makes use of legitimate Hawaiian culture, legitimate Hawaiian language, actual Hawaiian performers, vocal actors who are local. And Lilo and Stitch is also interesting because it's self-referential, as Disney movies are frequently now. They refer to older Disney films and older Disney film characters, or they make use of other references to popular culture. And in this film in particular, there are a number of Elvis songs. And I bring up Elvis because I'll be mentioning him later in the program. Well, obviously, comedic films also can not be animated cartoons, but have actual people starring in them. And here are two posters from two comedy films. On the left, The Three Stooges. The Three Stooges made hundreds of short comedic films from the 1930s to the middle 1950s. And they would have been completely forgotten, except that their films were then released to television in the late 50s. And a whole series of lots and lots of young kids became familiar with them from being on television, brought them back to popularity. Well, they made films in just every type of genre as much as possible, referring to different types of Hollywood genres. And like many other Hollywood films, they referenced Hawaii and the South Pacific. And here is a poster from about 1950 from one of those films, which is called Hoo La La La. And despite the title, they actually don't come to Hawaii in the film. They just come to a generic South Pacific island. And then on the right, a 60s comedy film, extremely obscure. It's not even sure if this was widely released to movie theaters or not. It is called One Way Wahine. And if I can read the poster's text for you, it says, "She's the swingin'est thing on Waikiki. That way out gal the smart guys call One Way Wahine." Well, this film was so low budget, as I said, it's very obscure. And that's a relevant thing for me to mention is that some of the films you're going to be seeing are extremely obscure. And even I have not seen them after years of trying to. But One Way Wahine is typical of a lot of the cheap films that were made here. Not everything that was made here or about Hawaii was a major motion picture, although we're going to be seeing a number that are. A genre once popular in Hollywood, which is now pretty much extinct, the cowboy film or the Western film. Innumerable Western films were made throughout a lot of the 20th century. So let's say from the very beginnings of movies in the early 1900s, the first fictional films, some of those were Westerns. And Westerns remained popular in Hollywood into the 1970s. But as I said today, they're mostly extinct. Well, very few of them used Hawaii as a setting. So this is one of the few, and it's from the 1930s. It's called Hawaiian Buckaroo. And it pretty much just reuses the plot of a lot of Western movies in which there is a beautiful young woman who is in some kind of problem, has some kind of trouble. The good looking, handsome, good guy cowboy comes and saves her from the bad guy cowboy. So in this particular poster, you can see the bad guy on the right looking very shifty eyed. And the good guy, named Smith Ballou, he is the star of this film. He's the guy who comes to the rescue of the young lady. Also, there are adventure films or thrill films or films that have some kind of sometimes criminal story. There were a fair number of those in Hollywood that occurred in the Pacific, but usually on generic, unnamed fantasy Pacific islands rather than actual Pacific islands. Well, here are two films made in 1957, made on location on the island of Kauai, both directed by a now famous director named Roger Corman, who made a lot of super low budget movies for this particular company at the time, American International Pictures, or AIP. On the left is a film that's not supposed to be in Hawaii, but is, again, a fantasy Pacific island, She Gods of Shark Reef. And let me read the text from that to you. Quote, "Beautiful maidens in a lush tropical paradise ruled by a hideous stone god." Okay. That promises more than you actually ever see in the film, let me assure you. And on the right, a film that was set in modern day Hawaii of 1957, originally released as Naked Paradise, and then re released with a new title, Thunder over Hawaii, 3 years later. This again is very low budget, but it does include actual Hawaiian people as extras, as background people, sometimes with small speaking parts. That's something noteworthy in that many Hollywood films never did that, even if they were supposed to be taking place here. They used Hollywood performers. Somebody who is a well known fictional character who is supposed to have lived in Honolulu is this man, Charlie Chan. Charlie Chan first appeared in a novel published in the 1920s, written by a man named Earl Derbiggers, and the novel was called House Without a Key. Charlie Chan was just one of the characters in that book, which was a murder mystery. And Earl Derr Biggers had visited here as a tourist in the 20s and became intrigued by an actual Honolulu Police Department detective named Chang Apana, who was Chinese. And he thought it was so unusual that an American police force would have a Chinese detective, which, of course, in the bulk of the United States at that time was extremely unusual, that he created a character called Charlie Chan. Charlie Chan became so popular that Biggers wrote other novels about him and then passed away in the 1930s. But starting in the late 20s, multiple films were made up into about 1950 with Charlie Chan as the main character. Interestingly, though, Charlie Chan, supposedly a resident of Honolulu, almost never appeared in Honolulu in his films. Almost every one of them, he was in some other location. And the reason he was in other locations was because he was a master detective. So he solved murder mysteries very skillfully. And even though he was incredibly stereotypical in the way that he looked with his mustache, in the way that he spoke in fractured English, in the way he always wore his white suit, it's important to note that all the other characters in his films always were very respectful of him. He was treated with more respect because of his intelligence and his abilities in these fictional films than Asian people were in reality in the United States, sometimes during this period in which these films were being made. And this example, Charlie Chan in Honolulu, was made in 1937. Something else that comes from Hawaii and has spread all over the world is surfing. And there are Hollywood films that use surfing, at least starting in the 1960s, when surfing suddenly became a major fad in the USA. The photo on the left is of the poster for the film Gidget Goes Hawaiian. And the phrase Goes Hawaiian is what I used as the title of this program, and it's also something that shows up in popular culture even to this day. There were three Gidget films. They were based on a book that was written by a man about his daughter in California, Southern California, who, as a teenager, had started surfing in reality. And the real life Gidget is still alive today. I've met her. The three films about Gidget, the first one was set in Southern California where the real Gidget lived, the second one here in Honolulu, and the third in, where was she? Rome, I believe. Totally irrelevant. There was also a Gidget TV series that followed this. And there was surfing in the Gidget films, but not a heck of a lot of it. On the right, Ride the Wild Surf. This is from a few years later in the 1960s. It's a drama, and it's about three women who are in love with three surfers here on the island of Oahu. And they actually did film a bunch of it here on Oahu, which is noteworthy for a Hollywood film. Again, it's very heavily fictionalized. Also involving surfing at this time, a bunch of cheap beach party movies that were made in California about California. Somewhat funny if you think that they are funny, a lot of fake shots of surfing. But then at the same time, starting in the 50s, there were real surfing films, low budget films made by independent filmmakers who actually filmed real surfers, not only here in Hawaii, but in other places in the world. And those are a separate genre, not affiliated with Hollywood because they are independent films, but which are very important within this entire concept. Now let's look at how Hollywood has used people of Hawaiian ancestry. And one of the major plots that shows up in a number of Hollywood films and in fiction in general during this time period in the 20th century. And that is the relationship between a Hawaiian or indigenous woman in the Pacific and a visiting white or haole man. And usually those relationships are doomed to a sad ending. What's important here is that during this time in American popular culture, for some reason, it was considered acceptable for depictions of Native women, dark skinned Polynesian women, and white men to be depicted. And that was not true of white men and Black African American women at the time. That was absolutely forbidden. So Hawaiians were in a different category in American popular culture. This film is from the early 1930s. It's called Aloha. It is a very low budget film made by a small independent studio. And it's about such a relationship. And I'll read you the copy from the ad on the left, which says, "She shocked them. They mocked her. This wild tropical beauty who wore a grass skirt to her wedding, but couldn't accustom herself to the silks, velvets, and garters, to the do's and don'ts of her husband's world." So that means, yes, this is a doomed, sad, tragic, rocky relationship. Well, another story that used that same concept and which was very popular and very influential in its time was this one. This is called Bird of Paradise. Bird of Paradise first appeared as a Broadway play in 1912, quite popular, and then for years after that into the 1920s. Small traveling companies went throughout the United States and internationally performing this story on stage. It was then made into films, the first on the left here from 1932, and the second one on the right from 1951. And the basis of the story was again a doomed interracial relationship, but more importantly, the woman had to jump in a volcano at the end to sacrifice herself to the pagan gods. This is where that concept comes from, which many people today still are familiar with. And I need to point out this is not something that ever happened in reality in Hawaiian culture. No people jumped into volcanoes, but this is the story that created it. And there are some comedy touches in these films, but basically they end as tragedies. Now, what's important is that none of the large speaking parts in either of these versions, both of which filmed on location here on Oahu and just on Oahu, none of the important parts were played by Hawaiian people. Hawaiian people were used in the background. They may have occasionally had small speaking roles, but the stars were always non-Hawaiian people. Something else that comes from a fictional basis from a book is two films from the 1960s. The book, titled Hawaii, was published in 1959, written by James Michener. It was a fictionalized version of Hawaiian history from the time of the arrival of the first missionaries in 1820. Huge, thick book. The story spans from 1820 up into the middle 20th century, 1900s. And it was such a massive book, but it was very, very popular. It was a bestseller. That two films were made of it. The first in 1965, which was just called Hawaii. That's the image you see in the center. And then the follow-up that brought the story into the early 1900s, or at least 1898. 1900, excuse me. The Hawaiians. And both of these were major Hollywood films. Both of them were filmed on location, not a lot of location filming. Very few of the people who appeared were actual real Hawaiian people, as usual, although some were. Neither film was particularly good. Both films are quite lengthy. Both films have some really laughable portions of misrepresentation of Hawaiian culture. And you'll notice that The Hawaiians, which was released in 1970, stars Charlton Heston, and I'm about to bring him up. But one person who appeared in the first film, Hawaii, who was completely unknown at the time and who was playing just the role of an extra as a missionary on the ship arriving in Honolulu or arriving in Hawaii, was Bette Midler, who later on in the 70s became a massive singing star and a big movie star. Well, Bette Midler was born and raised here, and this was her first movie role when location filming was being done. And after she appeared in that completely obscure part, and you can see her multiple times in the scenes that are shot on the ship, she moved to New York and then became a star. But to bring back Charlton Heston, here is another movie based on a novel. And this novel, which is called Diamond Head, was published in 1960, not as popular as the previous one. A fictionalized version of some activities and some people who might have been real. And this was the story of a missionary based or a missionary descendant family, very wealthy, owns a sugar plantation, and the patriarch of the family is Charlton Heston. And yet again, we have the interracial love affair. He will not allow his sister to have relationships with Hawaiian men, but he at the same time has a secret mistress who is Chinese. And finally, at the end, he realizes how hypocritical he is. And his mistress has given birth to his child. And even though his child is of mixed race, he will acknowledge this child as his son. So that's a step forward in race relations, you might say. Again, location filming, pretty ludicrous, pretty melodramatic, pretty silly overall. Another movie from a book, but this time a really good book and a really good movie, From Here to Eternity. From Here to Eternity was published in 1951, and it was a bestseller also. It was very raw. It was very profane for the time. It contained a lot of profanity, a lot of dirty words. It was made into a movie that was released 3 years later in 1954, and the movie had to be heavily censored because movies were censored at that time, even though books were not as much censored. In any case, the story had to be cleaned up a lot of things had to be changed, and yet the film came out really well. It is set in Hawaii at the time of the Pearl Harbor attack, before, during, and after December 7th, 1941. And the main characters are all involved with the Army. And it was based on the real experiences of the author's experiences as a soldier stationed at Schofield Barracks during that time. So he made a lot of references to real things, real people, but he turned it into fiction. Well, the movie was justifiably popular. It won 8 Academy Awards, so it was a big hit. This is one of the films that you might have heard of or maybe even have seen, even though it's quite old by now. And it still is a good book that stands up very well, and a good movie that stands up very well today. Because the American military was such a large presence here before World War II, in reality, Hollywood used the military in Hawaii as the basis of a number of films, particularly in the 1930s. And this is one of them, Wings Over Honolulu from 1937. And the main character, who is played by Ray Milland, is a US Navy aviator. He flies airplanes. And the bulk of the story is about how he and his wife have to adjust to their whirlwind courtship and marriage. He gets transferred here. She has to come with him, and she has to deal with being a wife of a military officer. In reality, at that time, Pearl Harbor was heavily developed. It was a major Navy base. And in 1940, I believe, the US fleet moved its headquarters from California here to Pearl Harbor. At the same time, as I just referenced in the previous film, the US Army had built a number of Army forts along the south shore of Oahu. And at the time, Schofield Barracks in central Oahu was the largest US Army base anywhere. That's why these films were made. And the Pearl Harbor attack led to a number of films, not only about that attack, but also about the war in the Pacific. And there were innumerable World War II films made for years, even up until recent years. that were set not only in the Pacific, but also in Europe, where the United States was also fighting. This film, which is called Remember Pearl Harbor, is from 1942, and it's a total misrepresentation because the film's plot is not about Pearl Harbor at all. The film takes place in the Philippines before, during, and after the Pearl Harbor attack. And at the same time, the Philippines were also attacked by Japan. The Philippines at the time were part of the United States. That's an important thing to keep in mind. This was complete misrepresentation, and reviewers at the time pointed this out, that this was just jumping on the bandwagon of a very, very famous event that had just happened a few months before the film was released. But it had been in production at the time of the Pearl Harbor attack. It was set in the Philippines. They kept that setting, but then they added references to Pearl Harbor and the Japanese attack. Remember Pearl Harbor, the phrase, immediately had become very popular in the United States as a kind of rallying cry for people to support the war effort in general. Here's a film from the 1960s, which has a provocative title, I Bombed Pearl Harbor. And this is actually a Japanese film made in Japan that begins with a depiction of the Pearl Harbor attack, which was done entirely with models, and then covers the entire Pacific War. And it's primarily a melodrama involving the characters, who are mostly military men, and sometimes they're civilian, who they are connected to in the civilian world. So Pearl Harbor doesn't play that big a role in this particular story, but I'm sure it lured people into the theaters, who probably in some cases were sort of disappointed to find out it was a dubbed Japanese film and not an American film for American audiences. Regardless, there have been a number of other films about the Pearl Harbor attack, specifically a number of other films that have used the Pearl Harbor attack as part of their story. And this is the biggest and grandest and most lush budgeted of all of those films. Another important one was Tora, 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 released in 1970, but this is far bigger than that. This is called Pearl Harbor. It's from 2001, and it does feature a very impressive, massive, lengthy sequence of the attack, very dramatically staged, as you can see in the picture on the right, but it goes on so long that it kind of wears you out. And then in the meantime, you've got hours worth of other plot, which is primarily a sort of a three-way love triangle, which is not by any means as interesting or important. Overall, this film was not particularly good. It did do very well, however. And now that Pearl Harbor and World War II are continuing to recede into the past, and those who actually experienced it are leaving us, it is extremely unlikely that there's ever going to be another major motion picture about the Pearl Harbor attack. And far fewer films will be made that are set during World War II. Finally, here is a genre once extremely popular in Hollywood, the musical. Musicals did not exist until the late 1920s because there were no sound films yet. And without soundtrack, there's no music and there's no singing. So you don't have any music to make a musical. Well, once sound films became technically possible, then a lot of musicals came into existence, particularly in the 1930s and 40s. And just because Hawaii was a setting that Hollywood was already using, there are a number of musical films with a Hawaiian setting. And here's one of those from the late 1930s called Hawaiian Nights, made by Universal Studios, which was a fairly low budget studio. They made a lot of low budget, but often enjoyable musicals. And they did more than one with a Hawaiian setting, including this next one, which is called Moonlight in Hawaii. And again, not filmed here because it wasn't a big budget movie. No, very few actual Hawaiian people will ever appear. People of other races are used to represent Hawaiians or Polynesians, and they're all extras who were in Hollywood. There were, however, a number of Hawaiian musicians who were performing in California, in Hollywood, and in San Francisco at that time, as well as not only in the rest of the United States, but throughout the world. They often appeared as themselves in these Hollywood musicals, particularly the low budget ones. And also in the 1930s, there were a lot of child stars. That's because Shirley Temple had become a huge star. She was the biggest star in Hollywood for 3 or 4 years in the 1930s. And she was a little kid. She could dance well, she could act, she couldn't sing too well, but her success led to a number of other child performers. And here's one of them. This is Bobby Breen. He, like some of the other child stars of that time, and unlike Shirley Temple, was an excellent singer. He had a semi operatic voice, kind of an adult style voice, and he could act. And he went through a short phase of quite good popularity, but he didn't have the longevity that Shirley Temple did. And this film, Hawaii Calls, made in 1937. Again, nobody came out here to film anything, but he does get to sing a lot of songs and engage in some intrigue, and there's some crime elements, etc. So it's an adventure story with him singing operatically. A big budget Hollywood film from this time period, 1939. This is called Honolulu. It was made by MGM, which was the biggest and most powerful Hollywood movie studio at the time. The stars of the film were big stars, well known. Eleanor Powell was probably the most adept and skilled dancer of any Hollywood musicals ever. She was incredibly good. She could sing, although her voice was usually dubbed. But unfortunately, she could not act very well, and that makes her movies not as successful as they might have been. In any case, this is a big budgeted film. They did do some location filming, but very little. The stars didn't come here. And also in this film, George Burge and Gracie Allen, a very popular comedy team. This was the last Hollywood movie they made together, but they became very popular in the 1950s as the stars of their own television series. And at the end of this film, or the finale, the musical finale of this film, is pretty ludicrous. It takes place in a fictional nightclub setting that's supposed to be at Waikiki, and it ends with Eleanor Powell doing a hula style tap dance while wearing silver high heel shoes. It's pretty good. I mean, it's very typical of Hollywood for the time. And another big budgeted film that starred somebody that was also very popular in her time. This is Betty Grable, Song of the Islands from 1942. Betty Grable was a huge star of the 1940s. She was a major pinup favorite among men in the military. And in this film, which was in production in December 1941 at the time of the Pearl Harbor attack, which was a terrible surprise for everybody, because the film was already in production and it was supposed to be taking place in Hawaii, they made some changes so that it wasn't specifically here as much as it had been, although the dialogue refers to being in Hawaii. It's also because Hawaii was associated with the start of the war in the United States, it was not as popular as it might have been. But Betty still looked beautiful and she did beautiful tap dances. It's also kind of self-referential and satirical in that when they stage these dances, in some cases, they're saying, this isn't real, we're putting on a show, and you're supposed to think that this is a lot of fun, but it's not the way Hawaii really is. And the movie that really set all of these other musical films off was this one, Waikiki Wedding from 1937, and it was a huge hit. It starred the biggest singing star at the time in the United States, who was Bing Crosby, very, very popular. And this film, which obviously has a Hawaiian setting, had a very popular song in it called Sweet Leilani. Bing Crosby's recording of Sweet Leilani was a huge hit song in the United States, to the effect that it also was claimed to have made a major difference in the success of the recording industry, which had been badly affected by the Depression in the 1930s, this song was so popular. And in fact, the song Sweet Leilani won the Oscar for Best Song of 1937. So that's how important this film was. And that's why this film's success inspired so many other Hawaiian themed musicals that I've just been showing you. And finally, we are going to end with the last gasp, if you will, of the musical genre with a Hawaiian theme. And these are the films of Elvis Presley. Elvis began his career in the middle 1950s, and he was kind of a dangerous guy at the time. He was considered a little too sexy, a little too out there. But over the following years, he got turned into a really clean-cut, acceptable, wholesome guy in the many, many musical movies that he made starting from the late 50s onwards. And they became so formulaic and so inexpensive that people really began to ignore them. But from 1961, Blue Hawaii was a huge hit. It was the biggest hit of all of Elvis's films. And it set the pace for all of the ones that came afterwards, which pretty much just reused all the same plot elements. Elvis did come out here and film this, and there are a lot of location shots on Oahu and Kauai. And there's a connection to the film that I just talked to you about, Waikiki Wedding, because this was made by the same movie studio, Paramount, and it used some of the same elements from the story of Waikiki Wedding, but most importantly, the title is the title of a song that was introduced in Waikiki Wedding, Blue Hawaii, which Elvis then sang again in this film, the way Bing Crosby had in the 30s. Elvis made another movie here called Girls, 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 and then finally he ended with his third location filming film here, which, as you can see on the right, is called Paradise Hawaiian Style. I think it is safe to say that as we look back over this movie saga, we're not going to be seeing a lot more films that are musicals anymore that take place here. We're not going to be seeing a lot more cowboy or Western films that take place here. We're going to be seeing not a lot of war movies that take place here. These genres are pretty much extinct, as I said before. We will continue to see Hollywood films made here, and we will continue to see TV series that are made here. But it's not going to be the way it was during the time period that I've just explained to you and showed you posters from. That brings us to the end of this episode of How Did We Get Here? Hollywood Goes Hawaiian. I'm DeSoto Brown. I hope to see you again in future programs I'm going to be doing for ThinkTech Hawaii. And until I see you again, thanks for joining me. And till later, aloha.